Why America's Iran war has already cost an estimated $37.5 billion. U.S.-Iran war cost hits $37.5 billion. But Trump's real bill is only beginning. The cost of America's war against Iran has reached an estimated $37.5 billion, according to U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, after an 11th consecutive night of renewed strikes. The number is extraordinary, but it does not mean the United States physically spent more than $3 billion on every night of bombing. The Pentagon figure reportedly combines money already consumed by the campaign with projected operational costs through September 30th. It therefore covers far more than aircraft dropping bombs over Iran. It includes missile defense, naval deployments, fuel, maintenance, logistics, force protection, and the enormous cost of replacing weapons already fired. How the bill reached $37.50 billion. Modern air warfare is expensive because every strike depends on a much larger military machine. A bomber sortie may require aerial refueling aircraft, surveillance platforms, electronic warfare support, rescue assets, intelligence analysts, satellite coverage, and protected bases across several countries. American destroyers, submarines, and carrier groups must also remain supplied, maintained, and defended. Aircraft fly longer missions, engines require additional servicing, and thousands of personnel receive deployment-related support. The cost continues, even during hours when no bomb is released. The greatest pressure may be coming from munitions. Long-range precision weapons can cost hundreds of thousands or several $million each, while the interceptors used against Iranian ballistic missiles and drones are often more expensive than the threats they destroy. Missile defense is not optional when American bases, ships, and allied territory are under attack. Congressional research shows how rapidly this area of defense spending has expanded. The Pentagon's 2026 plans included $40.2 billion in procurement and research funding for missile defeat and defense programs alone, while Congress authorized additional funding for systems including Patriot, THAAD, and Aegis. An estimated breakdown of the cost. The Pentagon has not publicly released a complete audited breakdown of the $37.5 billion. However, the scale of the campaign and the administration's supplemental request allow a reasonable reconstruction. Approximately $8 billion to $11 billion may relate to offensive munitions, including cruise missiles, air-launched weapons, guided bombs, and the replacement of weapons consumed during earlier phases. Another $7 billion to $9 billion could cover missile and drone defense, including ship-launched and land-based interceptors protecting U.S. personnel and strategic infrastructure. Aircraft operations, aerial refueling, maintenance, and accelerated engine wear could account for around $5 billion to $7 billion. Naval deployments, additional steaming days, carrier operations, submarine missions, and logistics may represent another $4 billion to $6 billion. The remaining $6 billion to $10 billion could include intelligence and surveillance, cyber operations, base protection, transportation, emergency repairs, personnel support, and projected costs through the end of the financial year. These ranges overlap and should not be treated as official accounting. They demonstrate, however, how the total can reach $37.5 billion without requiring every dollar to have been physically paid during the latest 11th night bombing sequence. Is the campaign unusually expensive? In absolute terms, $37.5 billion is already approaching the early direct cost of the 1991 Gulf War. By February 1991, the U.S. government estimated incremental costs for Desert Shield and Desert Storm at $31.6 billion, equivalent to roughly $78 billion in 2026 purchasing power using broad consumer price inflation. The crucial difference is that America's allies largely financed the first Gulf War. Governments pledged approximately $54 billion and ultimately contributed tens of billions in cash and practical support, allowing much of the incremental U.S. cost to be recovered. No comparable cost-sharing arrangement has yet been demonstrated for the Iran campaign. The Iraq War was far more expensive over time. At its mid-2000s peak, operations in Iraq were costing nearly $10 billion a month in the dollars of that period. The wider Iraq and Syria wars eventually generated approximately $1.79 trillion in expenditure through 2023, with total costs and future veterans' obligations estimated at $2.89 trillion. Afghanistan cost more than $2 trillion across 2 decades. Those comparisons show that $37.5 billion is not yet remotely close to the cost of America's longest wars. The danger is repetition. A highly intensive campaign sustained for months can rapidly become a trillion-dollar strategic commitment once reconstruction, borrowing costs, and veterans' care are included. Why Trump can still defend the spending. President Donald Trump's strongest argument is that the cost must be measured against the threat being confronted, not against an imaginary world in which Iran's military pressure simply disappears. Iran sits beside the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important energy routes. American officials have warned that Tehran could seek to impose control over the waterway, exposing global shipping and energy markets to sustained coercion. Preventing that outcome has an economic value far greater than the price of a limited military campaign if it protects energy supplies and restores freedom of navigation. Trump can also argue that allowing Iran to retain an expanding missile force, threaten American bases, and approach a nuclear weapons threshold would produce a far larger future bill. Deterrence is costly, but failed deterrence can require the deployment of vastly more troops under worse conditions. The administration must nevertheless explain its objectives clearly. A campaign designed to destroy defined military capabilities is financially and strategically different from an open-ended attempt to remake Iran. Trump's case remains strongest when the mission is narrow: degrade the threat, protect American personnel, reopen strategic waterways, and force Tehran into a settlement from a position of weakness. How much more could America spend? The administration is seeking tens of billions of dollars in additional defense funding. Accounts of the proposal place the wider supplemental request near $88 billion, with roughly $67 billion intended for the Pentagon and a substantial share devoted to restoring capabilities and munitions. Under a relatively rapid settlement, total direct U.S. military costs could finish between $50 billion and $70 billion. If high-intensity strikes and Iranian retaliation continue through September, the total could move towards $80 billion to $110 billion. A prolonged conflict lasting into 2027, particularly one requiring continuous carrier operations, regular missile interception, and the replacement of large weapons inventories, could exceed $150 billion. Ground operations or long-term occupation would transform the calculation entirely and risk reproducing the financial trajectory of Iraq. The $37.5 billion figure is therefore best understood as the cost of maintaining overwhelming American military power, not simply the price of 11 nights of explosions. Trump can credibly argue that decisive force now may prevent a much more expensive conflict later. But that argument depends on converting military superiority into a defined political outcome before a short punishing campaign becomes another permanent American commitment.